Hello everyone, it's been a while since we've done a podcast, a Humans of Nature podcast, but we're back again with a new chapter. And my name's Ratambra.
And my name's Vasindra.
And today actually marks our first episode of the Students of Nature podcast series, which is like hearing from like undergraduate students, master students, or like even those in the workplace who represent like the future of environmental science and activism, just bringing fresh perspectives and ideas to the table.
For today's podcast, join me in welcoming Ariana. She's an associate specialist for the conservation research at WWF Canada, and she works in the science, knowledge, and innovation team there. And she's also the co-founder and co-director of FREED, which is an organization that dedicates to increasing access to fieldwork for Indigenous people, Black, and racialized undergraduates. And she's also completed a Master's of Science at Western University, where she studied bird interactions with the Earth's magnetic field using advanced remote sensing technologies. So as you can see, she's already doing some pretty cool stuff with wildlife conservation, and she's been working on ways to help endangered species stick around. And she's here with us today to share what she's learned and what keeps her going in this field. So, Aranya, before we start, is there anything that you want to mention that we didn't cover or touch on yet?
No, that's a really good summary of all the things that are in my vicinity and in my orbit at the moment. So thank you for such a generous introduction.
All right, so then we'll start with the first question. So we know you've been working with endangered piping plovers. So could you share some of the challenges that these birds face, or how the World Wildlife Fund Canada assists in their conservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So piping plovers, for those who don't know, are these small shorebirds, which means they kind of hang out on the shorelines of lakes, sometimes even oceans. Specifically in Ontario, they hang out near shorelines of the freshwater lakes, and they're endangered primarily because of their nesting habits. So because they're sharing these beaches with humans, there is a little bit of conflict between nesting habitat for the birds as human use of beaches, and so these birds get disturbed easily. On top of that, they're also migratory birds, which means that they face a lot of threats when they're migrating from their nesting grounds to their wintering grounds. And at their wintering grounds themselves, there's a lot of threats when it comes to just lack of food and lack of habitat. So as WWF Canada, we take an ecosystem level approach, where we try and address the primary threats to these species and then look at the budgets and actions that requires in order to address these threats. So it doesn't necessarily focus on just piping plovers, but also focuses on all of the other shorebirds and other birds that use that nesting habitats along the shoreline.
Yeah, so you talked about the endangered, them being endangered because of nesting and the use of human beaches. And when you take this ecosystematic approach, how do you take measures to mitigate this impact that these migratory birds face?
Yeah, so a lot of the work actually happens in collaboration with partners who are on the ground. So there are typically conservation authorities, or there are, say, the Ministry of Environment and Parks, I believe, MECP. And so they're usually the ones who have workers who patrol the beaches and put up signs or inform and educate people about how they're sharing this habitat with these endangered birds. So as WWF Canada, we're not necessarily always doing the on-the-ground work, but we have a lot of partners on the ground who do that work.
Okay, thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, so our next question, it moves over from birds to fishes. So we know you're involved in enhancing the habitat for species like the short-nosed sturgeon, if I'm saying that correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So what specific actions are being taken to support their populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short-nosed sturgeon is this gorgeous fish, and I believe it's a migratory fish. As far as I know, there are, again, no specific actions that we're taking as WWF Canada to target this species. But in terms of larger work that we do, aquatic restoration and restoration of wetlands and habitats is a big part of our work. And when we address threats to things like the short-nosed sturgeon, it also benefits species beyond that when we say protect wetlands, and they also absorb things like carbon. So through nature-based climate solutions, you're not only addressing key threats to species like short-nosed sturgeon and the species that share its habitat, it shares its habitat with, but also looking at these larger ecosystem services that things like these wetlands provide.
Okay, so your approach, it's more like protecting the wetlands from carbon emissions, say. So what would you say are some ways that we could help reduce carbon emissions that ultimately affect the species like sturgeons in general?
Yeah, so some ways on an individual level that we can do, what we can do to reduce the carbon emissions would be, things like take public transit, being more aware of the consumption of fuel in our house when it comes to like heating and cooling. However, I would like to highlight that, a lot of these carbon emissions, sometimes it's framed as an individual's responsibility when really it is more systemic change that needs to happen. So honestly, one of the best things you can do for keeping carbon in the ground and sequestered is voting for the right people, and supporting the right people in more powerful places who can make these changes to, say, talk to industry and professionals that can actually make the change on the ground at a much, much greater scale.
Yeah, I completely agree. When it comes to like creating changes, people usually assume it's like, oh, if one person does it and 100 people do it, then they'll see a difference. But at some point, it's the people that are controlling what we do, and it's us who have to vote for the right people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and also like moving further with like the other species you work, like the blanding turtles. So like, what are like the primary threats that they encounter, and like what initiatives does the WWF implement to safeguard them?
Yeah. So I think you're going to probably notice a trend in my answers. As WWF Canada, we've moved away from species-specific conservation, and we focus more on ecosystem and habitat level approaches. We do have certain teams that say focus on key habitats, like we have an Arctic team that focuses particularly more on Arctic species. And so when it comes to these species-specific approaches, we take more of the side of like, how do we work with people who are actually doing, say, turtle watches or turtle monitoring on the ground or turtle research, and how do we support them to indirectly help all of these species. Blanding's turtle are actually these gorgeous turtles that have a little yellow under their chin, and they're beautiful. And one of my colleagues, Rita Meng, actually works on them. And when I hear her talk and some of the research that I've also done, one of the ways that these turtles are endangered is because of road mortality. And so when they're moving between, say, their nesting habitat and their wintering habitat, or just as they're traveling within their habitat, when roads cross these habitats and basically disrupt them, they're still trying to get across the road. And when there's cars on the roads, they have crashes and these animals perish. So road mortality is one of the biggest threats to turtles, blanding turtles, but especially turtles just in general.
Yeah, because you said that you move away from working on like specific like species, and you like do more on like habitat conservation, as well as like with the turtles. Their biggest threat is like the road mortality, and like how like the roads are killing them. And I think we should be looking out for this problem, because I feel like a lot of turtles probably get affected a lot with this type of threat.
Like, even when we go up north on drives, we've seen turtles crossing, and the amount of cars that are on the road, it's like rare to see them even stop. It's like a coincidental moment when we see the car go right over the turtle. The turtle's just sitting in the middle, right? So we probably need to tell people like better signs, because they're all hidden behind the trees, and we need to be more aware of when they come out, what time in the seasons they come out, and everything like that too.
Yeah, and like even in general, like you'll see like a lot of like road killings outside, like generally everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I have a question for you folks. Have you ever heard of these animals called salamanders?
Yes.
So salamanders actually face a similar threat, and salamanders, one of their biggest threats is road mortality, but there's actually a really cool thing that a city within the GTA, I want to say it's near Guelph, does, where they shut down a road during salamander migration so that all of the salamanders can cross the road safely. And then that road is open for the rest of the seasons. But in order to protect this population of salamanders, they're able to do that really well. So I would highly recommend looking into that. The city is, I think, escaping me right now, but I want to say it's within the GTA.
That's really good. I didn't know that was even a thing here in the GTA.
No, I think like they have signs like that, like somewhere. I know like up north I've seen like, oh, like there's like deer crossing, or like even at beaches there's like signs of like there's turtles here, like be careful.
Sometimes they even have timestamps, and I don't know if that means they'll be able to cross at those specific times.
Yes, so there are a lot of signages that help with indicating that, oh, you know, these are turtles, or this is like between this and this time, it's peak migration movement, so be more wary of animals crossing. But I think especially when it's these huge 6-lane highways, it's really hard to make everyone who's driving on them become very conscious about it. But yeah, it is definitely one of the major threats for all of these like reptiles and amphibians.
So like more in like the conservation route, how do you like envision like new technologies transforming like the methods for like caring for endangered species?
In terms of technology, like it can help with both biodiversity and carbon. So with technology, say for biodiversity, you have different ways to collect data, to manipulate data, and to analyze them. So a big part of conservation is monitoring and doing field work. However, field work is very expensive, can sometimes be unsafe, and requires a lot of human hours dedicated to it. But say if you're able to use either drones or satellite systems or anything along those lines that allows you to remotely collect that data, it makes it sometimes safer, it makes it cheaper, and it makes collecting all of that data continuously more possible. So that's one way that technology can help with biodiversity monitoring, which can also help you understand, say we're implementing something on the ground, how does that have an effect to the animals before and after, and are the strategies that we're using actually helpful?
Yeah, you mentioned that it takes a lot of people to do this field work that later gets examined. And my question is that, I don't know if this is a problem, but do you know any ways that high school students, which I know a bunch of people that would be eager to do stuff like this, so do you know of any opportunities where they could like help out in this field work, like even do the smallest bit of data collection that would help you guys and that you guys could later examine?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. There's a lot of different ways that people of any ages and any abilities can get involved. So there's obviously things like eBird, which, have you heard of eBird before?
Is that the bird recognition app where you put like where they were located wherever you saw them?
Yeah, very similar. So basically, if you're ever going on a hike and you're able to spot a bird and you can note down any of its behavior, you can then upload that data, and then researchers can use that data, which is sometimes called citizen science or community science, and then use it in their own projects. There are also things like iNaturalist, where you can upload a photo and someone else will ID it for you, and some people can scrape iNaturalist for information to use in their own projects. There's also like turtle watches and butterfly watches and things along those lines. I think Journey North is related to butterflies, and there are like wildlife naturalist clubs and things in almost every city. So if you join them, you will be able to find like how are the ways that you can contribute to data collection and monitoring, because almost everyone does some level of that and then submits it to a larger data collection body.
Yeah, I just wanted to like add on about like field work. I know like a lot of researchers use like a tagging system to like tag like animals and like to see like where they're like predominantly are in like the area. Like, have you used anything like that in like your field work?
Yeah, so in some of the work that I was doing out in Oregon and California, I was working at a bird banding station, which is essentially when you use these thin nets to catch birds early in the morning when they're moving around. And once you catch them, you extract them, and you basically give them jewelry, which is like these individual rings that we wrap around their legs. Sometimes we give them color bands, so it's that silver aluminum band that's kind of like a fingerprint that's unique to just them. And you have bands on their other legs, so even after you release the bird and you see it somewhere in the field, you can read off the color band and say like, you know, the left leg had pink and the right leg had blue and yellow, you can then submit that information and someone will be able to be like, oh, this is when that bird was released, this is when it was tagged, this is where it has been seen. So that's one way to do it, but you can also put actual GPS tags and geolocators on birds through essentially a little backpack and help them cover their wings, and they carry that geolocator with them as they move across the different continents when they migrate. And that automatically also collects information.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. Since you've like used like all these like technologies in your fieldwork, like do you have like one that you think works the best for you?
It really depends on how big is the animal and what is the research question that you're trying to answer. There are some technologies that will allow you to answer really like specific research questions if you have only specific data. But those specific data, because it's collecting so much information, will typically require larger units, and those larger units can only fit on larger animals. So it really has to depend on like, how can you minimize the harm to the animal? What is the research question you're trying to answer? And kind of try and find trade-offs between the two.
Oh, so it like kind of depends on like the type of research that you're doing.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
like, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go back to like the geo backpack you were talking about on the migratory birds. Does it affect their flight?
So we specifically use the size of tags that is specific for that animal and that weight to avoid it actually having a negative impact on the birds.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah. They've put, not the same kinds, but they have put tags on the smallest things like hummingbirds and insects and butterflies as well. So you can also track their movement.
Oh, insects? That's so cool. I didn't even know that they could be that small.
Yeah.
Yeah, their technology is making them fascinatingly small. So
that's so cool. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. So I want to talk more about how the work you do relates to the policies that are made. So how does the research that you conduct at work influence the policies that aid in the protection of whatever species you're talking about?
Yeah, so a lot of what WWF Canada does is try and find evidence-backed, try and create and find evidence-backed research that will then help policy. And when you are an organization that has so much recognition and branding behind it, and it has an international network, you are able to use some of that weight to put pressure on politicians and policymakers. And that primarily just happens through relationships. Like, you have relationships with people in those places, and then you can use the research and the results you have to influence their decisions. So that's in a process called lobbying. And so you're lobbying the government in order to make better changes. And there are specific arms of the organization that are, say, really just tied to wildlife and industry, or there are those that are tied to just restoration, or there are those who are tied to just management, and all of them can use their research, can use their data, can use their relationships to then lead to those changes in policy.
So what about for people who are probably like in their undergraduate studies, not in any formal organizations, who want to have some type of impact in policy making? You said there should be recognizable like organizations that would put pressure on the people who make the policies. So how do you think they should get started with like working with these formal organizations, or where can they reach out to learn more about this?
Yeah, so there are actually organizations that put pressure on government in order to make better decisions that are not affiliated with these large nonprofits. There is one that exists in the Peel region. I think it's not coming to my mind. It's climate change or something or the other. I can send you the information afterwards. Or I can give you, if you give me like 30 seconds, I can pull it up. So there is an organization called Community Climate Council, and they work within the Peel region to do things like climate cafes and rallies in order to put pressure on local governments in order to make more environmental decisions. So getting involved in something like that is actually very beneficial, and it's a grassroots way to show support, to have an impact. Whereas when you're trying to engage larger, say, corporates or nonprofits, I think the best way to support them is through donations, so that people in positions like myself can do work, and people who eventually end up in my positions who are undergrads and who have that research background and want these jobs they have enough support and resources to continue doing the work that they want. So there's kind of two different streams.
Okay, we'll definitely link all of this on our website so everyone knows where to access it. Thank you for that.
And we'll definitely look into the Community Climate Council because I've actually never heard of that. Even though it's in Peel region, we should know what that is.
No, they're really great, and the co-founders are really lovely, and they're doing good work.
Well, that's great. We're just gonna go on to the next question. So it's actually really commendable that your team consists like primarily of women, and like how do you think this influences like the work that you do?
Yeah, I think the environmental sector in large part is very female based, and I think maybe because there's a lens of like this is service, this is like caring work, and all of kind of those very feminine quoted qualities. I think I'm lucky in that I don't sense the impact of it or the lack thereof. Like it's very much just like it's a very comfortable environment to work in. I'm never questioned on the level of like gender of like, oh, you know, do I deserve to be here, or is there like something that I don't know. It's just a very comfortable, encouraging workplace environment, and I can't necessarily tease out if that's just part of like the work that we do or if it's created by the individuals who are there. But I guess what I can say tangibly is that it has given me a lot of role models in this field, and a lot of colleagues who support my work, and it feels very lovely to have that.
I feel like it's great that you have a work environment like that, especially like women in STEM. You don't really see that often, so it's really great that your team is primarily women. It's great to see.
Yeah, it's really awesome.
Yeah, and we always wrap up our questions with the main one that we get from people outside the organization, and it's that what advice would you offer people aspiring to do a career in conservation, particularly with endangered animals?
Yeah, I would say spend as much time as you can outside learning about all the different things that you can. And once you spend that time outside, you'll be able to pick up on the different patterns of the landscape. You'll be able to pick up like the natural rhythms of how ecosystems are changing, and it'll become very intuitive to you. And it kind of also becomes its own knowledge set that you can't really get by reading research papers or by being in a lab or by being on a computer. So if the thing that you really care about is being in conservation and knowing how it works and really progressing in it, having that foundation of having spent time outside is a really big asset.
So thank you for that. And we just want to say that actually wraps up our first episode of the Students of Nature podcast, and we want to thank you for being our inaugural guest and for sharing all the ideas from the different varying topics that we asked you. And we just want to ask you if there's any thing in particular you want us to promote, any upcoming projects or events or even publications that you'd want more people to hear about, so then we can do our best to amplify its effect on our end. You could please let us know.
Yeah, so obviously if you want to know more about all the work that WWF Canada does, head over to wwf.ca. We also have a platform called Regrow that individuals can sign up to track if they're planting native plants or helping or doing anything on the ground. It's kind of a Canada-wide effort to track all of these changes to restoring Canada's landscapes, even if they are urban landscapes. And I would encourage people to check out the other hats that I wear, primarily FREED, which stands for Field Research in Ecology and Evolution Diversified. If they're at all interested in getting involved in field work, and they are an undergrad student somewhere in southwestern Ontario who are interested in ecology and evolution, we would be happy to chat with them.
All right. Thank you so much, Aranya. It was so nice talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for giving me the space. You both have brilliant questions and are really, really intelligent folks. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to be here.
Thank you.